She was sold by her parents for being infertile, until the Alpha King chose her. Today we'll dive together into a narrative that transcends centuries, where true love faces the shadows of a curse and redemption blossoms even in the darkest hearts. This is a story from a time when shifters ruled kingdoms, where being different meant being cursed, and where one woman found the strength to love beyond appearances. In the medieval kingdom of Thornwick, a woman marked by barrenness is to be offered as a servant to a dark creature. But is the true monster in the tower, or on the throne, an ancient curse, an impossible love, and secrets that could transform an entire kingdom? Where are you watching this story from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like for more soul-stirring narratives. Year 1481, Kingdom of Thornwick, Village of Millhaven. Autumn had painted the leaves of the oak tree protecting the Bramblewood cottage in gold when the hooves of horses echoed on the dusty road. Marguerite lifted her eyes from the parchment she was illuminating with delicate, intertwined flowers, her fingers still scented with the golden ink she had used to bring the ancient letters to life. The breeze carried the aroma of ripe apples and the melancholy of the last harvests, but also something denser, the metallic scent of fear that had hung over Millhaven since the ducal decrees reached the village. Sir Roderick, the tithe collector, dismounted with the predatory grace of one who carried the power of Duke Edmund in the folds of his scarlet cloak. His eyes swept over the grey stone cottage, pausing on the grapevines Margot had tended with such care, now heavy with grapes that had never ripened due to the storms that had ravaged the region. Thomas of Bramblewood, his voice cut through the silence like a cold blade. The tithes have been tripled by order of His Excellency, Duke Edmund Blackthorn, Margot's father, a man whose shoulders carried the weight of the years and the inability to transform into his lupine form, as was customary among noble shifters, bowed his head with a dignity that cost more than gold. Sir Roderick, our harvest was decimated by the rains. The vines, he gestured to the plants blackened by hail. The difficulties of the climate do not alter the needs of the duchy, the collector interrupted, his fingers drumming impatiently on the hilt of his sword. 3 gold coins, or other forms of payment. It was then that Isabel appeared in the doorway, her 18 years blossoming into curves that promised fertility and lineage, precious qualities in an age where bloodlines were everything. Her golden hair caught the autumn light like strands of wild honey. Sir Roderick's smile took on a different, more calculated quality. "Your youngest daughter is of age to serve at the castle," he murmured, and the air seemed to thicken around the words. Thomas interlaced his fingers, a gesture that Margot recognized as the prelude to painful decisions. His eyes turned to her, sitting by the window with her scribal work, and she saw something in them that chilled her blood. "Marguerite will go," he said, and each word fell like a stone into a deep well. "It is she who must leave, father." Isabel's voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Marguerite has already been married," Thomas continued, his voice gaining the hardness of one who must justify the unjustifiable. 6 years with Sir Geoffrey, and not one heir. She is, marked by the devil, sterilized by her sins. Isabel can still bear children, continue our lineage. Margot felt the words pierce her like needles of ice. She knew the truth behind her sterility, the multiple miscarriages that had left her empty inside, each loss a quiet little funeral she had carried alone. But in the society of Thornwick, a woman who did not bear heirs was seen as cursed, especially when she did not even possess the gift of transformation that marked the shifters. Sir Roderick observed Margot with an appraising eye, noting her ink-stained hands, the carefully organized parchments, the straight posture that spoke of an education uncommon for a peasant. "A scribe," he murmured, almost to himself. "Interesting. Yes, she will serve the castle's special purposes well." Margot carefully folded the parchment she was illuminating, a story about a maiden who found her strength in solitude. Her hands did not tremble, though her heart felt as if it had turned to cold stone. "When must I leave?" she asked, her voice as serene as the surface of a lake on a windless morning. "At dawn," Sir Roderick replied. "Bring only what is necessary. The castle will provide all else as needed." That night Margot stayed awake, organizing her precious manuscripts into a small wooden chest. Each parchment contained stories she had collected over the years, Celtic legends about transformations, Arthurian romances about true love, Latin prayers she had learned from the local priest. They were her only treasure, her only identity besides the marked woman. Isabel came to her when the moon was high, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Margot, I could go in your place." It's not fair that— Justice, Margot interrupted softly, touching her sister's face with fingers that smelled of parchment and ink, is not measured by what we deserve, but by what we choose to do with what we are given. And so, as the autumn wind whispered through the leaves of the ancient oak, Margot prepared to leave behind the only life she had ever known, heading towards a destiny that none of her ancient stories could have predicted. The fortress emerged from the morning mist like a creature of nightmares, its black towers piercing the grey sky with the arrogance of ancient spears. Margot felt a shiver run down her spine as the iron gates groaned open, echoing across the time-worn stone courtyard. 4 other maidens waited in the main hall, their eyes revealing different shades of fear and resignation. All seemed to be between 16 and 20 years old, all carrying the mark of peasant beauty that blossomed despite hardship. Margot, at 24, felt like a late-blooming rose among spring buds. Dame Agnes, the Castellan, moved among them with the efficiency of someone accustomed to preparing human offerings. Her hands, rough as tree bark, checked the cleanliness of each fingernail, the texture of each hair, the firmness of each tooth. "A bath first," she declared with a voice that resembled the grinding of stones. "Then purification. The water, perfumed with rose petals and basil, was too hot, almost a punishment." Margot let the warmth penetrate her tense muscles as Dame Agnes scrubbed her skin with a stiff-bristled brush, as if trying to remove not just the dirt of the journey, but any trace of her previous life. "You're different from the others," Dame Agnes murmured as she untangled Margot's brown hair. "Older. More educated." "I read and write," Margot answered simply. The Castellan's small, penetrating eyes narrowed. "What good is a woman who reads when she can serve in other ways?" Margot did not answer. In truth, the question echoed within her like a funeral bell, reminding her of all the times her education had been seen as inadequacy, her culture as eccentricity. When they were all dressed in simple white linen tunics, Dame Agnes led them through corridors that seemed to have never known sunlight. Faded tapestries covered the stone walls, depicting scenes of hunting and battle where shifters in their beastly forms dominated human prey. The throne room was a cathedral of shadows. Pillars of black marble supported a vaulted ceiling that was lost in the darkness, and in the center, on a throne carved with intertwined figures of wolves and eons, he sat, Duke Edmund Blackthorn. Margot had heard stories of his cruelty, of the iron fist with which he ruled Thornwick, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of his presence. Tall and imposing, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of dark amber, he possessed a beauty that bordered on the supernatural. But it was a cold beauty, like a marble statue that had never known human warmth. His eyes swept over each of the maidens with the attention of a predator evaluating its prey. Some trembled under his gaze, others lowered their eyes in submission. Margot kept her chin held high, meeting his gaze with a serenity born not of courage but of acceptance. "Names," he commanded, his voice echoing through the hall like the distant roar of a storm. One by one, the maidens identified themselves. When it was Margot's turn, she took a step forward. "Marguerite of Bramblewood, Your Excellency," she said, and then, because nervousness made her seek comfort in the familiar, she added in Latin, "May your mercy be with us." The silence that followed was absolute. The Duke tilted his head slightly, and Margot saw something akin to interest ignite in his amber eyes. "Latin," he murmured, more to himself. "How many women of your station know Latin?" "Only one, it seems," Margot replied, and there was something almost like humor in her voice. Duke Edmund descended from the throne with feline movements, stopping before her. He was tall enough that she had to raise her face to meet his eyes, and when she did, she felt as if she were looking into an abyss that was looking back at her. "You will be the chosen one," he declared, and his words sealed a destiny that no prayer could alter. Dame Agnes murmured instructions to the other maidens, who were led back to the servants' quarters. Margot remained alone in the hall, the echo of her own heartbeat seeming amplified by the vastness of the space. "Is there something I should know?" she asked the Duke, who had returned to his throne but continued to watch her with that unsettling intensity. "There will be time for knowledge," he replied, and there was something between the lines of his words that promised revelations she might not wish to receive. "Dame Agnes will lead you to your special quarters. Prepare to serve in a way none of the others could." And so, as the sun set behind the castle's black towers, painting the stones blood red, Margot was led through more corridors, more spiral stairs, more doors that closed behind her, like chapters in a book whose ending she could not yet see. The West Tower awaited her, and with it an encounter that would test not only her courage, but the very essence of her soul. The ascent up the West Tower's spiral staircase seemed to last an eternity. Each worn stone step told a story of previous footsteps, of other women who had perhaps made the same journey. Dame Agnes carried a torch that cast dancing shadows on the circular walls, creating the illusion that ancient spirits were watching them. "Here," the Castellan said when they reached a dark oak door, reinforced with wrought iron in patterns that resembled intertwining vines. "Your quarters." The chamber that was revealed beyond the door was a paradox of luxury and melancholy. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, but their tones were dark, deep blues, moss greens, twilight purples that absorbed light rather than reflected it. A black marble fireplace dominated one wall, and before it, chairs upholstered in burgundy velvet awaited conversations that would never happen. Dame Agnes placed a tunic on the bed that took Margot's breath away. The black velvet was so deep it seemed to absorb light, and the edges were decorated with silver threads, forming ancient Celtic patterns, symbols of protection and transformation that she recognized from her manuscripts. "Wear this," the Castellan instructed, also extending a silver torque, a Celtic necklace of considerable weight whose ends curved into shapes that resembled dragon heads. "And wait." "Wait for what?" Margot asked, but Dame Agnes had already left, the sound of her footsteps fading on the stone stairs. Alone, Margot put on the tunic with reverence. The fabric caressed her skin like warm water, and the torque settled on her shoulders with a feeling of ancestral weight. When she looked in the polished silver mirror, she saw a stranger who could have stepped out of a Celtic legend, a priestess or a queen of a kingdom lost in time. The daylight gradually disappeared through the chamber's only window, an arched opening that offered a view of the distant mountains. Margot positioned herself by the unlit fireplace, her fingers unconsciously tracing the embroidered patterns on the tunic as she tried to decipher what kind of service would be expected of her. That's when she heard it. First, just the whisper of something moving in the corridor. Then a sound she could not classify, not exactly footsteps, but also not the dragging of something being pulled. It was rhythmic, yet irregular, as if something large and heavy was approaching with caution. The door opened without the sound of a lock or hinges, and Margot saw the creature. Her first reaction was complete freezing, neither flight nor confrontation, just the total suspension of all movement and breath. The creature was impossible to classify in any known category. It was approximately the height of a very tall man, but its form was a disconcerting fusion of different bestial natures. The head had the bone structure of a wolf, but elongated and more refined, with eyes that gleamed with a distinctly human intelligence, golden amber that she recognized, though she could not place where from. The body was humanoid in its upright posture, but covered in a dark coat that shimmered with metallic blue reflections under the torchlight. The hands were almost human, except for the claws that curved where the nails should have been, but it was the wings that made the creature truly supernatural. Not bat or bird wings, but something in between, membranes of dark leather supported by slender bones that extended from its shoulder blades, now folded against the body like a living cloak. The creature stopped in the doorway, and Margot realized that it too was evaluating, observing, trying to decipher some mystery. "You didn't scream," it said, and its voice was the biggest surprise of all. It was deep yet melodious, laden with an accent that suggested education and refinement. There was something familiar about it, a cadence that echoed some undefined memory. "Should I have screamed?" Margot asked, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. The creature took a few steps into the chamber, its movement fluid despite its impossible form. "All the others screamed," it replied, and there was a deep sadness in its words. "Some fainted, one tried to throw herself out the window. And what happened to them? They were returned to their families with convenient stories about their unsuitability for service at the castle." The creature positioned itself near the fireplace, its claws making a soft sound as they touched the stone. "But you have something different." Margot studied the creature, noticing how the torchlight revealed ancient scars in its fur, how its eyes carried a depth of suffering she recognized in herself. "What is expected of me?" she asked. "Company," the creature replied simply. "Conversation, the ability to look at me without horror or pity. And in return?" "In return," the creature hesitated, and then its words came out in a torrent that seemed to have been dammed up for a long time. "In return, I would offer union, matrimony, a life shared with someone who understands the loneliness of being what should not exist." The silence that followed was as thick as velvet. Margot felt the weight of the proposition, not only in its words, but in all the implications they carried. This creature, whatever its nature, offered something no man had ever offered her, complete acceptance of who she was, flaws and all. "A long time ago," she said finally, "I learned a truth about riddles. The most obvious answer is rarely the correct one." The creature tilted its head, interested. "And what would be your answer to my proposal?" Margot smiled, and it was a smile that carried all the melancholic wisdom of her 24 years. "I am woven from unspoken words, nourished by forgotten dreams, and only in darkness do I blossom into light." "What am I?" The creature watched her for a long moment, and Margot saw something that could have been admiration gleam in its amber eyes. "A worthy riddle," it murmured. "Very well. Then our alliance will be built upon mysteries, and each night I will try to decipher your nature, just as you will try to decipher mine." And so, in the shadows of the West Tower, under the ancestral gaze of silver-embroidered Celtic symbols, two solitary souls began a dance that would test the limits of love, curse, and redemption. Dawn came with fingers of golden light that filtered through the arched window, waking Margot from a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in years, she had slept without nightmares, without the ghostly memories of the children who were never born visiting her dreams. Dame Agnes arrived with the peal of the morning bells, carrying a simple grey wool tunic that contrasted dramatically with the black velvet of the previous night. "The Duke wishes to see you," she announced dryly, gathering the luxurious tunic as if it were evidence of some unconfessed crime. The servants they met on the way to the main hall whispered among themselves, their eyes following Margot with a mixture of awe and suspicion. A chambermaid made the sign of the cross as she passed, and a young squire muttered something that sounded like "witch" before being silenced by a severe look from Dame Agnes. Duke Edmund awaited her not in the throne room, but in his personal library, a space that revealed an unexpected facet of his personality. The walls were covered with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with leather-bound volumes, ancient parchments, and carefully preserved maps. The aroma of old paper and ink mixed with the subtle scent of beeswax from the candles that provided additional lighting. He was standing by a table where manuscripts were spread out, wearing not his ducal robes, but simple dark wool clothes that made him look more like a scholar than a feudal lord. When he raised his eyes to her, Margot noticed something different in his expression, a tension that was not present the day before. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. Margot obeyed, watching how he moved through the library with the restlessness of a caged predator. His hands, she noticed, were elegant for a warrior, long, agile fingers that spoke of someone accustomed to handling both parchments and swords. "The servants talk," he said finally, stopping before her. "They whisper about how you survived the first night without incident." "And what exactly do they whisper?" "Witchcraft," the word came out like a sharp blade. "Pacts with demons. Heresy." Margot maintained her serene expression, although she felt danger hanging in the air like the smell of heated iron. "And does your excellency believe these whispers?" Edmund moved to stand directly in front of her, his hands resting on the arms of the chair, trapping her between his arms without touching her. His amber eyes pierced hers with an intensity that seemed to seek secrets buried in her soul. "What I believe is irrelevant," he said, his voice low but laden with a veiled threat. "What matters is that you understand this perfectly. Any mention of what you saw, what you heard, any peculiarity of the special quarters will result in your burning for heresy in the main square." The silence that followed was as thick as wet wool. Margot studied the Duke's face, looking for some clue about the nature of the secrets he guarded so fiercely. There was something in his eyes, an ancient pain perhaps, or the weight of responsibilities that went beyond the governance of a duchy. "I understand," she said simply. "Understand what exactly?" "That there are secrets in this castle worth more than the life of a marked woman like me," Margot replied, and there was a melancholic acceptance in her voice that seemed to surprise him. "And that my tongue must remain as still as stone if I wish to continue breathing?" Edmund stepped back, his expression changing to something she could not fully decipher. There was approval there, but also something that might have been relief. "The clothes you wore yesterday will be returned to the ducal quarters," he informed her, returning to his table and pretending to study a map. "You will serve as any other servant during the day, only your nightly activities will remain unchanged. And if the servants continue to whisper, then they will discover that there are fates worse than the pyre." His voice carried a dark promise that made Margot understand why he was feared throughout the kingdom. Dame Agnes appeared in the doorway as if she had been waiting for an invisible signal. "Lead her to the kitchens," Edmund ordered, without lifting his eyes from the parchments. "Let her work with the other women, and make it clear that any speculation about her activities will result in severe punishments." As she was led through the corridors, Margot reflected on the complexity of the situation she was in. The Duke fiercely protected secrets involving the creature in the West Tower, but there was something more, a connection between them that she could not yet name. The amber eyes of the creature and the amber eyes of the Duke. The strange familiarity of the voice, the refined education that showed through in the words of both. A puzzle was forming in her mind, pieces that fit together in an almost impossible way, suggesting a truth that would be even more extraordinary than the existence of the creature itself. But for now, she would guard this growing knowledge, as she had guarded so many other secrets throughout her life, buried deep where only she could find it, when the time came to use her wisdom. The days unfolded at a rhythm that recalled the ancient work songs her mother hummed while weaving. Margot woke with the morning bells, descended to the kitchens where her skillful hands soon found purpose in preparing bread and organizing spices. The other servants treated her with a respectful distance, neither hostility nor friendship, but the silent acknowledgement that she carried some kind of special protection. During the daylight hours, she spun linen and embroidered delicate lace for the ducal garments, work that her educated hands performed with a precision that impressed even Dame Agnes. But it was the nights that gave meaning to her days. When the shadows lengthened and the last evening bells echoed through the towers, Margot climbed the spiral staircase with her heart racing in anticipation. The creature, she still did not know what to call it, always awaited her, sometimes near the fireplace, sometimes by the window watching the stars that were beginning to awaken in the darkening sky. "Tonight," she said on one of those nights, settling into the chair that had become hers, "I would like to tell you about Melusina, the serpent woman who married a mortal." The creature settled on the floor near the fireplace, a position that made it seem less imposing, almost vulnerable. Its wings folded against its body like a cloak, and the golden light of the fire danced on its dark fur, creating hypnotic patterns. "Melusina," it repeated, and there was genuine curiosity in its voice. "Tell me." Margot began the narrative with the musical cadence she had learned from the bards who visited the village in her childhood, her voice painting images of impossible love and broken promises. As she spoke, she watched how the creature leaned forward, absorbing every word like a thirsty man absorbing fresh water. And so, she concluded, Melusina was condemned to wander eternally, neither completely human nor completely something else, punished for loving beyond the limits that the world considered appropriate. "A sad story," the creature commented, "but perhaps there is hope even in the most ancient curses." "There is always hope," Margot replied, and there was a deep conviction in her words, "even when we cannot see it." The nights followed one another, and with them came a growing familiarity. The creature revealed an extraordinary intelligence, able to debate scholastic theology with the same ease as it discussed manuscript illumination techniques. Its opinions on philosophy were sophisticated. Its questions about human nature demonstrated a comprehension that went beyond the intellectual. It was on the 10th night that the creature made a gesture that completely changed the dynamic of their encounters. "I have something for you," it said, and in its claws it held a delicately crafted key. "Dame Agnes will lead you tomorrow." The key opened a smaller chamber attached to her quarters, revealing a complete scriptorium that took Margot's breath away. Parchments of the highest quality vellum, inks in every imaginable shade, perfectly trimmed goose quills, brushes of marten hair for the most delicate work. It was a treasure worth more than a princess's dowry. "Why?" she asked, her fingers reverently caressing a parchment whose texture was as fine as silk. "Because I saw how your eyes shine when you speak of your manuscripts," the creature replied, "and because a soul that finds beauty in the written word is a soul that understands the true nature of creation." That night, Margot felt compelled to share something she had never told anyone. "There were times," she said slowly, "when I carried life inside me. 5 times. And 5 times that life left, before it could know the light of the sun." The creature was still, as if even breathing might break the sanctity of the moment. "The doctors said it was God's will," Margot continued, her hands clasped in her lap, "that a woman who cannot transform into the bestial form of her ancestors should not try to perpetuate an impure lineage. And you believed them." "For a long time, yes," she admitted. I believed I was defective, marked, cursed by some sin I could not remember committing. The creature then moved, not with the bestial fluidity she had learned to recognize, but with something more human, more hesitant. It stopped before her, and when it spoke, its voice carried an emotion so intense it seemed to burn. "I would honor you more than any princess whose womb produced a dozen heirs," it said, "because I know that true fertility does not reside in the ability to bear children, but in the ability to nurture beauty, wisdom, and love in a world that often seems devoid of all those things." Margot raised her eyes to meet his, and in that moment, she felt something stir in her chest. Not the familiar pain of her broken heart, but something new, something that seemed to grow like a long-planted seed, finally finding fertile soil. "Will you accept to be my consort?" the creature asked, as it did every night. And like every night, Margot answered with her riddle, "I am woven from unspoken words, nourished by forgotten dreams, and only in darkness do I blossom into light." But tonight, for the first time, she saw something different in the creature's amber eyes, a growing understanding, as if he were finally beginning to decipher not only her riddle, but the nature of the soul that had created it. Autumn matured into winter, and with it came an unexpected change in Margot's routine. Duke Edmund, for reasons he did not deign to explain, granted her permission to work as a scribe during the daylight hours, instead of performing domestic tasks in the kitchens. The ducal library became her daytime sanctuary, just as the West Tower was her nightly refuge. Sitting at a table by the window, where natural light complemented the candles, Margot transcribed legal documents, ducal correspondence, and, when time allowed, worked on personal projects. It was on one of those afternoons, as the winter sun created golden patterns through the stained glass window, that she began her most ambitious project, the illumination of a manuscript about The Maiden Without a Wolf, a Celtic legend she had collected years ago about a woman who found her strength not in bestial transformation, but in the acceptance of her purely human nature. Each initial letter was a miniature work of art. The O of Once Upon a Time transformed into a tower intertwined with flowering vines, where a female figure watched the stars through an arched window. The N of No Magic became a tree whose branches extended to form the lines of the letter, with golden birds nestled among the leaves. "Exceptional work," a familiar voice commented behind her. Margot did not startle. Over the weeks, she had learned to sense the Duke's presence even before she saw him, as if a particular energy announced his approach. "Your Excellency is kind," she replied, continuing the delicate work of applying gold ink to the edges of an illumination that depicted a woman feeding wild deer with grains from her own hand. Edmund positioned himself beside her table, observing the manuscript with genuine attention. Margot noticed that he was once again wearing simple clothes, and that his hands, when he pointed to a particular detail of the illustration, trembled slightly. "This story," he said, his voice strangely altered. "Where do you know it from?" "It was told by my grandmother," Margot replied, dipping the brush into an emerald green ink to add details to the leaves. "She said there were women whose strength lay not in transforming into something else, but in remaining exactly as they were." "And do you believe that?" Margot stopped painting and lifted her eyes to him. There was something in his expression she could not define, a carefully hidden vulnerability, like an ancient wound that still hurt when touched. "I believe that sometimes we are exactly what we need to be, even when the world tells us we should be different," she replied carefully. The Duke was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the illumination, where the maiden extended her empty hands to wild creatures that approached without fear. "Continue your work," he said finally, but his voice carried a different quality, almost grateful. That night in the West Tower, Margot found the creature in a state of deep contemplation. It was standing by the window, watching the first winter stars that were beginning to shine in the darkening sky. "I have been thinking about purpose," the creature said without turning around, "about whether there is divine meaning even for existences like ours." Margot settled into her usual chair, watching how the moonlight was reflected in the creature's dark fur, creating an almost ethereal aura around its impossible form. "St. Paul wrote about true love," she said softly, "that it does not envy, does not boast, does not seek its own interests. Perhaps purpose is not in being what others expect, but in loving despite our own limitations." The creature then turned, and in the silver light Margot saw something in its amber eyes that made her lose her breath. It was a tenderness so deep it seemed capable of healing ancient wounds just with its intensity. You speak of love as if it were a conscious choice, the creature said, not a passion that consumes, but a decision that renews itself every day. Isn't it? Margot asked. The love that withstands time, difficulties, differences that seem insurmountable. Isn't that a choice we make repeatedly? The creature approached, moving with that strange grace that was part feline, part something more ancestral. It stopped before her chair, and when it spoke, its voice carried a weight of emotion that made Margot's heart race. I choose to love you, it said simply. Your brilliant mind, your hands that create beauty where before there was only blank parchment, your ability to find sacred meaning even in existences that the world considers cursed. Margot felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from an emotion so complex it had no name. It was gratitude mixed with awe, tenderness tempered with something that could have been the awakening of love itself. And she began, but stopped, the words trapped in her throat like frightened birds. What? The creature asked gently. I love your soul, Margot whispered, but I fear that by accepting your heart, I may be accepting a temptation that will condemn me. And what if it is not temptation, the creature asked. What if it is redemption disguised as something the world cannot comprehend? The question remained suspended in the air between them, like incense in a cathedral, laden with possibilities that neither of them yet dared to fully explore. But that night, for the first time when the creature repeated its eternal question, Margot hesitated before answering with her riddle, and in that hesitation lived the germ of a decision that would change both their lives forever. A fortnight had passed like pages of a luminous book, each night bringing conversations that deepened the connection between two souls who found mutual recognition in shared solitude. Margot had finished the illumination of The Maiden Without a Wolf, and the manuscript rested on her table like a talisman of possibilities. On that night, she would later think of it as the night of the choice, the creature seemed different. There was an expectation in the air, like the tension that precedes a summer storm. The creature moved through the chamber with restlessness, its wings occasionally opening slightly before closing again against its body. I am tired of riddles, Margot said suddenly, interrupting a conversation about the nature of the human soul. The creature stopped, turning to her with its full attention. What do you mean? My riddle? Margot stood up, moving to stand before the creature. I was hiding my answer behind words because I was afraid of choosing wrong, afraid of condemning myself, afraid of loving something the world would consider an abomination. And now, Margot extended her hands, and after a moment of hesitation, the creature covered them with its own claws. The touch was surprisingly warm, and she could feel the carefully controlled strength within them. Now I believe that perhaps God places love in our hearts exactly where it should be, even when we cannot understand his designs, she said, her voice firm, despite the trembling she felt inside. Yes, I accept to be your consort. The creature stood completely still for a moment that seemed to stretch for all eternity. Then a sound escaped its throat, something between a sigh and a sob of relief. Are you sure? It asked. Once you accept, you cannot go back. The consequences... I don't care about the consequences, Margot interrupted. I care about the life we could build together, whatever it looks like. At that moment, as if the universe had been waiting for her decision, the morning bells sounded through the castle towers. The first peal of dawn echoed through the chamber, and something extraordinary began to happen. The creature let out a cry that seemed to tear the very air, falling to its knees as its body began to writhe. Margot recoiled, terrified, thinking that her acceptance had somehow caused pain to the creature she loved. But it was not pain, it was transformation. The dark fur began to recede, revealing human skin underneath. The wings folded in on themselves until they completely disappeared. The facial bones reshaped, the lupine structure softening until it revealed features that made Margot gasp in recognition. When the transformation was complete, Duke Edmund Blackthorn was kneeling on the stone floor of the chamber, naked and vulnerable, his amber eyes lifted to her with a mixture of hope and terror. Margot, he said, and it was the same voice she had learned to love, but now coming from the lips of the man who ruled Thornwick. I can explain, but Margot was backing away, her mind struggling to process the impossibility of what she had witnessed. The man who had chosen her from among the maidens, who had threatened her with the pyre for heresy, who so fiercely protected the castle's secrets, was the same soul she had learned to love in the darkness of the tower. You are both, she whispered. A gypsy witch cursed me, Edmund said, rising slowly. grabbing a quilt to cover his nakedness. 5 years ago, I executed her daughter for heresy. I was young, arrogant, believed I was doing God's will. In her last breath, the witch condemned me to transform every night until someone truly loved the creature I became, completely ignoring the identity of the man underneath. And now, Margot asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now you know the truth, Edmund replied, and there was despair in his voice. And I fear you fell in love with the creature, only to discover that you love a man you should despise. Margot looked at him, truly looked, seeing for the first time how the amber eyes were exactly the same, how the refined education, the careful kindness, the tortured soul that recognized her own pain. Everything was true in both forms. I need time to think, she said finally. Edmund bowed his head, a sorrowful acceptance that spoke of years of rejection and solitude. Dame Agnes will lead you wherever you wish to go, he said formally. You are free to leave if you so choose. And so, as the sun fully rose over Thornwick, painting the castle stones a rosy gold, Margot descended the West Tower's spiral staircase for the last time, carrying in her heart a love that had revealed itself to be more complex than any legend she had ever heard. The road that stretched before her led to the convent of St. Brigid in the mountains. It was there that she would seek the wisdom to understand if what she felt was true love or simply the illusion of a lonely soul that had finally found companionship. The convent of St. Brigid nestled among snowy peaks like a secret whispered by the mountain itself. Its grey stone walls had witnessed centuries of women seeking refuge, redemption, or simply the peace that the outside world denied them. For Margot, it became a place of deep contemplation on the nature of love, curse, and choice. The Mother Superior, a 60-year-old woman whose blue eyes seemed capable of seeing through the masks people wore to hide their true natures, received Margot without unnecessary questions. There was ancient wisdom in the way she simply indicated a small but comfortable cell and said, "Stay as long as you need to find your answer." The days at the convent followed the rhythm of prayers and manual labor. Margot spent most of her time in the convent scriptorium, copying sacred texts and illuminating devotional manuscripts. Her hands found comfort in the familiar work, but her mind remained restless, repeatedly revisiting the nights in the West Tower. Was it Edmund who had said he would honor her more than any fertile princess, or had it been the cursed creature? When he spoke about St. Paul and true love, from which form did that wisdom come? The line between man and beast had become so blurred in her memory that she began to understand a fundamental truth. Perhaps they had never been separate entities to begin with. The seasons changed around the convent. Winter covered the mountains with pristine snow. Spring brought wildflowers that transformed the meadows into living tapestries. Summer ripened into an abundance of medicinal herbs that the sisters cultivated in their walled gardens. It was in late summer that the news arrived that would make Margot question if her seclusion had been wisdom or cowardice. Sister Catherine, the youngest of the nuns, returned from a trip to the valley with eyes shining with excitement and a bag full of news from the outside world. "Duke Edmund is getting married," she announced during the evening meal, her voice echoing through the silent refectory. "Lady Catherine of Northumbria arrived a week ago with a retinue of 100 knights. They say she is the most beautiful woman in the north, and the wedding will be celebrated in the main square, so that all the people can bear witness." Margot felt as if a cold stone had lodged in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her spoon, and she had to make a conscious effort to keep her expression neutral. "When?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "On the feast of St. Michael," Sister Catherine replied. "Just 2 weeks from now." That night Margot stayed awake in her narrow cell, watching the stars through the small window, the same stars she had contemplated from the West Tower, the same constellations that the creature, that Edmund, had identified for her in their nights of conversation. Could it be the breaking of the curse? Would Lady Catherine, young and probably a virgin, be able to love both the man and the creature? Or had Edmund simply given up on finding true love and chosen the path of political convenience? In the morning, Margot requested an audience with the Mother Superior. "I need to go to Thornwick," she said without preamble, "for the ducal nuptials." The Mother Superior studied her face with those penetrating eyes that seemed to read stories written on the soul. "Are you sure it is wisdom?" she asked gently, "or simply a need of the heart?" "I don't know," Margot admitted, "but I know that if I don't go I will spend the rest of my life wondering what if, and that would be a different kind of curse." "Then go," the Mother Superior said simply. "But remember, sometimes witnessing the end of a story is the only way to understand what our role in it truly was. And so, a week before the feast of St. Michael, Margot descended the mountains towards Thornwick, carrying in her heart a resolve she did not yet fully understand. She would be a witness to Edmund's wedding, and then she would allow fate to show her which path she should follow. What she did not expect was to discover that witnessing the end of a story is sometimes just the way a new story begins. The main square of Thornwick had been transformed into an open-air cathedral. Garlands of autumn flowers, golden chrysanthemums, purple asters, and late roses in shades of amber decorated every post and window. The smell of fresh bread and warm wine mixed with the incense burning in bronze braziers positioned around the makeshift altar in the center of the square. Margot positioned herself by the stone well at the edge of the crowd, her monastic hood pulled low enough to shade her face, but allowing her to observe everything. She had arrived in the city the night before, staying in a small inn where no one recognized her, just another pilgrim drawn by the celebrations. The people of Thornwick had gathered in great numbers, their best clothes creating a sea of earthy colors, punctuated by the occasional finer fabrics of prosperous merchants. Children ran between the legs of adults, their laughter echoing against the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, while street vendors offered sweet pastries and spiced ale. But Margot noticed something that others seemed to have missed: mercenaries disguised among the celebrants. Men with overly watchful eyes, positioned strategically near the exits of the square, their hands resting casually near the weapons hidden beneath their seemingly festive cloaks. The sound of trumpets announced the arrival of the wedding party. First came the Knights of Northumbria, their polished armor reflecting the autumn sun like mirrors. Then, in an ornate litter carried by 4 white horses, came Lady Catherine of Northumbria. Margot had to admit that the descriptions had not been exaggerated. Lady Catherine was truly beautiful, hair like liquid gold braided with pearls, skin as fair as porcelain, and a smile that radiated the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Her 18 years seemed to blossom in every graceful movement, every studied gesture of her delicately gloved hand. But it was Lady Catherine's eyes that made Margot frown slightly. They were blue as sapphires, but there was something cold in them, a calculating quality that contrasted with the artificial sweetness of her smile. When Edmund appeared, emerging from the cathedral in his full ducal robes, Margot felt her heart involuntarily race. He was magnificent. The black velvet of his clothes enhanced the intensity of his amber eyes, and the ducal crown on his head captured the light like a miniature constellation. But Margot, who had learned to read the nuances of his expression during their nights of conversation, saw what no one else seemed to notice: the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes scanned the crowd with something that could have been a search or a farewell. The Bishop of Thornwick, a corpulent man whose purple vestments made him look like a ripe plum, began the ceremony with a voice that echoed through the square like the roar of an old lion. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." But Margot lost the Latin words when her eyes met Edmund's across the crowd. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, the world around them disappeared. Edmund saw her, and she watched as his features transformed. Surprise, then recognition, then something that could have been desperate hope or hopeful despair. He faltered in the recitation of his vows, his voice vowing that Lady Catherine would be his beloved wife, becoming almost inaudible. Lady Catherine shot him a sharp look, her lips pressing together slightly, before she resumed her expression of bridal happiness. It was during the final blessing, when the bishop was raising his hands to pronounce the sacred union, that Margot noticed movement in the shadows between the buildings. The disguised mercenaries were positioning themselves, and she saw the unmistakable gleam of arrowheads being aimed at the altar. An ambush, but against whom? Her answer came when a man dressed in the colors of the North, but whom she now recognized as one of the mercenaries, shouted, "Death to the usurper! Long live the true Duke of Northumbria!" And then the square exploded into chaos. The first battle cry tore through the festive air like a blade through silk. Margot saw crossbowmen emerging from the shadows between the buildings, their weapons aimed not only at Edmund, but at anyone wearing the colors of Thornwick. "Crossbowmen in the towers!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the initial panic of the crowd. Her warning saved at least a dozen lives, including that of Edmund himself, who threw himself to the ground a fraction of a second before an arrow shot through the space where his head had been. The chaos spread like fire in dry straw. The crowd screamed and ran in all directions, trampling on flower garlands, and knocking over braziers that scattered burning incense across the square. Knights from both sides drew their swords, the sound of metal against metal creating a deadly symphony that echoed against the stone walls. Margot moved instinctively towards the altar, where Edmund was fighting two mercenaries while trying to protect Lady Catherine, who had fainted and lay unconscious on the marble steps. It was then that she saw the leader of the rebels emerging from the crowd, a tall man wearing armor that mixed elements of Northumbria with symbols she did not recognize. His sword was already stained with blood, and his eyes sought Edmund with the hunger of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "Blackthorn," he roared, "your reign of terror ends today." Edmund turned to face the new opponent, but he was clearly at a disadvantage. The fight against multiple attackers had left a cut on his left arm, and Margot could see fatigue beginning to weigh on his movements. The rebel leader took advantage of a moment of Edmund's distraction to lunge with his sword raised. Margot saw the blade descending and without thinking shouted, "Edmund, look out!" Her voice made both Edmund and the rebel turn momentarily. It was then that the enemy leader saw her clearly for the first time, and a cruel smile spread across his scarred face. "The Duke's special servant," he murmured, moving quickly to grab her before she could retreat. Perfect. His strong hands pulled her against his chest, and she felt the cold tip of a dagger pressing against her throat. "Surrender, Blackthorn!" the rebel shouted, "or your harlot dies!" Edmund stopped completely, his sword lowering slightly. Margot saw the conflict in his eyes. The trained warrior, who knew he should never negotiate with terrorists fighting against the man who had learned to love her. "She has nothing to do with this," Edmund said, his voice laden with a pain that cut Margot's heart. "Let her go." "Oh, but she has everything to do with it," the rebel laughed. "Everyone knows about the Duke's special predilections, his nightly visits to the West Tower, the whispers about witchcraft and demon pacts." It was at that moment that the evening bells began to sound through Thornwick, marking the end of the day. The first peal echoed through the warring square, and Margot felt the man holding her stiffen when he saw the transformation begin. Edmund screamed, not from pain, but from rage and despair. His form began to writhe, bones lengthening, muscles expanding, skin giving way to the dark fur she knew so well. His clothes tore as wings emerged from his shoulder blades, and when the transformation was complete, the creature she had learned to love was standing before the entire square, exposed to the twilight. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rebels stopped fighting, their mouths open in shock at the impossibility of what they were witnessing. "Demon," the rebel leader whispered. "We knew you were cursed, but this—" The creature that was Edmund advanced, and even the most experienced mercenaries recoiled before the primitive fury that emanated from its transformed form. But Margot saw something the others missed, the human intelligence still shining in its amber eyes, the careful restraint of its strength, the desperate love that guided every movement. "Let her go," the creature said, and its voice carried an authority that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The rebel, now trembling, pressed the dagger deeper against Margot's throat. "Stay away, demon, or she dies." It was then that Margot made the choice that would change everything. "I love you," she said, her voice clear and firm despite the blade at her throat, her eyes fixed on the creature. "Both of you, the man and the creature. For soul you are in all your forms. Is that what you need to hear? Is that what breaks the curse?" The creature stood completely still, as if Margot's words had had a physical effect on it. "I choose you," Margot continued, tears streaming down her face. "Not despite who you are, but because of who you are, completely, without conditions." And then something miraculous happened. The creature's form began to shine with a golden light that seemed to come from within, and slowly, gradually, it began to transform back. But this time it was different, not the forced transformation of dawn, but something voluntary, something chosen. When the light faded, Edmund was standing where the creature had been, naked but human, his amber eyes shining with a liberation that spoke of years of captivity finally coming to an end. "The curse is broken," he whispered, and there was wonder in his voice. "Because you chose love instead of power, acceptance instead of transformation." The rebel leader, confronted with miracles that his mind could not process, released Margot and backed away, his hands trembling. "Witch," he whispered. "Sorceress." "No," Margot said softly, moving to stand beside Edmund. "Just a woman who learned that true love does not try to change who we love, but chooses to love them exactly as they are." And so, in the main square of Thornwick, before terrified subjects and defeated enemies, two souls found their redemption not in transformation, but in the complete acceptance of their true and imperfect natures. The rebel mercenaries, confronted with miracles that defied their understanding of the world, laid down their weapons, one by one. Some fled into the growing shadows of twilight, others remained kneeling in the square, their minds struggling to process what they had witnessed. Dame Agnes appeared with a cloak to cover Edmund's nakedness, her eyes revealing not surprise, but profound relief, as if she had carried the weight of terrible secrets for too long. "Is the curse truly broken?" she asked in a low voice, as the black velvet cloak settled on Edmund's shoulders. "Forever," he replied, his eyes fixed on Margot with an intensity that spoke of gratitude that transcended words. "There will be no more transformations, no more nights of torment." Lady Catherine had woken during the final chaos, and now observed the scene with eyes that shone not with horror, but with something akin to a calculating relief. She rose gracefully, brushing imaginary dust from her wedding garments, and approached Edmund with the confidence of someone accustomed to turning impossible situations into personal advantages. "I believe I can assume that our matrimonial arrangement has been nullified by circumstances," she said, her voice carrying poorly disguised relief. "In fact, I confess that this resolution is more convenient than Your Excellency could imagine." Edmund frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" Lady Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile she had shown throughout the visit. "Because my heart already belongs to another," she admitted. "Sir Marcus of Ravenshollow, a knight of my own court. Our marriage was arranged for political reasons, but I always knew I would be unable to truly love any other man." She turned to Margot, and there was genuine admiration in her eyes as she continued, "What I witnessed today, the love you share, is something every woman should be lucky enough to experience. I bless you both." The Bishop of Thornwick, who had remained hidden behind the altar during the battle, emerged with his confused but determined expression of a man of faith confronted with miracles that defy established dogma. "There was divine intervention," he declared, as if naming the inexplicable could make it more understandable. "Clearly God desired a different union than the one we planned." Edmund extended his hand to Margot, and when she took it, she felt the same spark of recognition she had experienced on the first night they touched in the West Tower, but now amplified, purified, free from the shadows of the curse. "Marguerite of Bramblewood," he said, his voice echoing through the now silent square. "Will you be my wife? My true consort, chosen not by political arrangement or desperate need, but by love?" "I will," she replied, and her words carried the weight of a promise that had been forged in nightly conversations about hope and redemption. The bishop, clearly deciding that it was better to bless miracles than to question them, raised his hands in a blessing. "Then before God and these witnesses I declare you husband and wife," he pronounced, his voice gaining strength as he convinced himself that he was serving a divine purpose. "May the love that broke an ancient curse be the foundation of a union that will withstand all future storms." The crowd of Thornwick, which had witnessed impossible transformations and miracles that defied comprehension, erupted in cheers. Perhaps they did not fully understand what had happened, but they recognized the triumph of love over dark forces, and that was enough. Dame Agnes approached Margot, her rough hands delicately holding hers. "I always knew it would be you," she murmured. "Since the first night you survived without screaming, a soul that could see beyond appearances to find the truth underneath." "How did you know about the curse?" Margot asked. "Because I was there when it was pronounced," Dame Agnes replied, her eyes distant with memory. "I saw the gypsy witch die. I heard her words of condemnation. I spent 5 years waiting for the woman who would be wise enough to love not the appearance, but the soul." As the crowd gradually dispersed, celebrating with wine and spontaneous music in the nearby taverns, Edmund and Margot remained in the square, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "You are a story waiting to be told, woven from unspoken words between us, nourished by dreams we almost gave up on having, blossoming into light only when it found the darkness it needed to grow. And so, under the benevolent gaze of the constellations that had witnessed their love grow in the nights of the West Tower, they began the first night of their lives as husband and wife, knowing that they had found not only love, but redemption in the mutual acceptance of their true and imperfect natures. "My riddle," Margot said softly. "Have you deciphered it yet?" Edmund smiled, and it was a smile free from the shadows that had haunted his expression for so long. "A story," he replied. The months that followed the wedding brought changes that spread through Thornwick like ripples in a calm lake. Edmund, freed from the weight of the curse, revealed himself to be a fundamentally different ruler from the tyrant his previous reputation suggested. The cruelty that had characterized his reign, it was discovered, had been a carefully constructed mask to maintain distance from subjects who might discover his secret. Margot found her role as Duchess not in the ceremonial splendor she had expected, but in serving as a bridge between Edmund's transformed heart and the needs of the people. Her mornings were spent in the audience hall, where her unusual education and ability to read and write made her invaluable in reviewing laws and ducal correspondence. "The feudal code needs to be reformed," she said one winter morning, as she examined parchments detailing the obligations of the serfs. These laws were written to maintain distance, not to serve justice. Edmund, sitting at his table, watched as she pointed to specific sections of the documents, her quill leaving delicate marks on the margins where she suggested changes. "What do you propose?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "Basic rights," Margot replied. "The right to a trial before punishment, the right to a fair share of the harvest they cultivate, the right to protection against abuses of authority. Some will say that weakens ducal authority. Others will say that it strengthens it," Margot retorted, raising her eyes to meet his. "A ruler who genuinely protects his people inspires loyalty that no force can break." The reforms were implemented gradually, first tested in villages near the castle before being extended throughout the duchy. Margot insisted on personally visiting these communities, observing how the changes affected the daily lives of the peasant families. It was during one of these visits to the village of Millhaven, her own hometown, that she encountered her parents for the first time since she had left almost 2 years before. Thomas of Bramblewood was clearly older, his hair now completely grey, but his eyes shone with something between pride and regret when he saw his daughter emerge from the ducal carriage. "Margot," he said, and there was a break in his voice she had never heard before. "Father," she replied, and she found that forgiveness was easier than she had anticipated when one was truly happy. Isabel, now married to a young blacksmith from the village, hugged her sister with tears in her eyes. "You found your place," she whispered. "I always knew you would." "I didn't find it," Margot gently corrected. "I created it." With someone who understood that sometimes the most beautiful places are those we build from nothing. The seasons passed, bringing not only political changes, but deep personal transformations. Edmund revealed himself to be a thoughtful husband, whose gratitude for the liberation from the curse was translated into small daily gestures: wildflowers left on her work table, rare books acquired from traveling merchants, long walks through the library where they discussed philosophy and politics in equal measure. But it was in the spring of their second year of marriage that came the surprise neither of them had dared to hope for. "I am with child," Margot announced one morning when the first flowers were blooming in the castle gardens. Edmund stopped completely, the quill he was holding dripping ink onto the parchment he was signing. "Are you sure?" "Dame Agnes confirmed it," Margot smiled, her hands resting instinctively on her still flat belly. "She says it will be autumn." Edmund rose slowly, moving to her with the reverence of someone approaching a miracle. When his hands covered hers over her belly, Margot saw tears shining in his amber eyes. "After all you suffered," he began. "Perhaps," Margot interrupted gently, "some blessings only arrive when we are ready for them, when our hearts are large enough to hold both love and hope." And so, as Thornwick blossomed under a transformed government and its people learned to trust in the justice of their leaders again, Edmund and Margot awaited the arrival of a child who would be raised not only as the heir to a duchy, but as the product of a love that had proved to be stronger than any curse. The cycle of redemption was completing itself, and with it came the promise that sometimes the happiest endings are just beginnings in disguise. Autumn arrived with an abundance that Thornwick had not known for years. The harvests were so rich that the granaries overflowed. The grapevines produced grapes so sweet that the wine would be celebrated for generations, and even the ancient olive trees, which had long stopped bearing fruit, blossomed with a generosity that made the peasants whisper about divine blessings. Margot, now visibly rounded with her pregnancy, spent the last month supervising the preparations for what would be known as the Feast of Redemption, a celebration that would combine the abundant harvest with the expected birth of the ducal heir. It was on a September night when the moon was full and the golden fields seemed to shine with their own light that the first pains began. Dame Agnes, who had assisted in countless births throughout her decades of service, remained calm as she led the preparations. Margot was taken to the ducal quarters, where a special chamber had been prepared with fine linen, medicinal herbs, and all the provisions necessary for a safe birth. Edmund, banished from the chamber by tradition but reluctant to stray too far, spent the night pacing the castle corridors like a restless spirit. His footsteps repeatedly led him to the library, where he tried unsuccessfully to concentrate on ducal documents, and to the chapel, where he knelt before the crucifix, offering fervent prayers for the safety of his wife and child. The hours dragged on with the slowness of centuries. Every cry that came from the chamber made Edmund wince. Every period of silence terrified him even more. Dame Agnes appeared occasionally to report that everything was progressing normally, but her words offered little comfort to a man whose entire life had changed through his love for one woman. It was close to dawn that the first cry of a baby echoed through the corridors. Edmund stood up from the chair where he had finally forced himself to sit, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. He waited, counting every breath, until Dame Agnes appeared in the library doorway with a smile that completely transformed her normally austere face. "A son," she announced, "healthy and strong. And Margot." "Tired, but well," Dame Agnes replied. "And there's more." Edmund frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Twins," Dame Agnes said, her smile widening. "A son and a daughter, both perfect." Edmund felt as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment. Twins. After all the years of loss, of mourning for children who were never born, Margot had given birth to 2 children at once. "Can I see them?" "Come," Dame Agnes said simply. The birthing chamber had been transformed into a scene of domestic peace. Margot was propped up against tall pillows, her brown hair spread around her shoulders like a veil, her cheeks flushed with the effort and joy of a successful birth. In her arms, she held 2 small bundles of white linen. Edmund approached the bed as if he were on sacred ground, his eyes absorbing every detail of the scene before him. Margot raised her eyes to meet his, and the smile she gave him could have lit up the entire fortress. "Our children," she said softly. Edmund sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, observing the small faces that appeared between the folds of linen. The boy had dark hair like his, but his eyes, when they opened briefly, were a deep brown like Margot's. The girl was clearly his sister, but with more delicate features and hair that promised to be her mother's dark honey color. "They are perfect," Edmund whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "And completely human," Margot added, understanding his unstated concerns. Dame Agnes confirmed it. "There is no trace of the curse, no mark of a supernatural inheritance. They are simply ours." Edmund extended a finger and watched in amazement as the boy's small hand closed around it with surprising strength. "What shall we name them?" Margot had thought about this during the long months of waiting. "Geoffrey," she said, watching Edmund's reaction to the name. "In honor of the man who taught me that sometimes our first loves are not our last loves, but they can still be blessed. And she, Eleanor. For my grandmother, who taught me that true nobility comes from how we treat those who can offer us nothing in return." "Geoffrey and Eleanor of Thornwick," Edmund repeated, testing how the names sounded. Heirs to a duchy built on the understanding that true power resides not in dominating others, but in serving with love. And so, as the rising sun painted the castle windows a rosy gold, a family that had been forged in a curse and redeemed in love welcomed a new generation that would carry forward the lessons learned in the dark towers and illuminated chambers where 2 solitary hearts had found their mutual redemption. The unspoken prophecy was being fulfilled. The love that had broken an ancient curse was now creating legacies that would last for generations. 2 years later, Feast of St. Michael. The great hall of Thornwick Castle shone with a golden light that seemed to emanate not only from the hundreds of candles in silver candelabras, but from the very joy that permeated every stone, every tapestry, every face present. The harvest feast had become an annual tradition that celebrated not only the bounty of the land, but the transformation of a duchy that had emerged from the shadows to find prosperity and peace. Margot, wearing a deep blue velvet dress that enhanced the color of her eyes and adorned with the Celtic embroideries that had become her personal mark, watched from the main table as her people celebrated. Geoffrey, now a robust 2-year-old boy with his father's tireless curiosity, ran among the tables chasing a small dog that Edmund had gifted to the children. Eleanor, more contemplative like her mother, remained close by, observing everything with large, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world around her. "Look at this," Edmund said softly, gesturing to the crowded hall. "Who would have imagined that the woman who arrived here as a tithe payment would become the architect of such a great change. Not just me, Margot replied, intertwining her fingers with his. Us. Together, we created something neither of us could have achieved alone. Across the hall, she saw Dame Agnes talking animatedly with Sir Marcus of Ravenshollow, who had arrived a few days earlier with news that Lady Catherine had married him in an intimate ceremony. Happiness radiated from the couple, validating Catherine's courageous choice to follow her heart instead of political obligations. The Bishop of Thornwick, who had discovered an unexpected vocation for blessing unions born of true love, moved among the guests with generous smiles and conversations that spoke of a man who had found renewed purpose in serving a prosperous community. Even Thomas of Bramblewood was present, his reconciliation with Margot having deepened over the years to become a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Isabel and her blacksmith husband had moved to a house near the castle, where she served as one of Margot's ladies-in-waiting, and he provided improved farm tools that had contributed to the abundant harvests. "There is something I have saved for this night," Edmund said, rising from his chair and offering his hand to Margot, "a surprise I hope you will appreciate." Intrigued, Margot allowed him to lead her through the festive hall, climbing the familiar staircase that led to the West Tower. She had not been there since her wedding night, preferring to leave that space as a sanctuary of memories without disturbing it with everyday reality. When Edmund opened the door to the chamber where so much of their story had unfolded, Margot gasped in surprise. The space had been transformed into a magnificent scriptorium. The walls were now covered with shelves filled with carefully preserved manuscripts, not only her own works but collections of legends, stories and knowledge gathered from across the kingdom. Work tables positioned near the windows offered ideal light for illumination, and writing supplies of unparalleled quality awaited use. "How?" she asked, her fingers reverently stroking a shelf filled with leather-bound volumes. "For 2 years, I commissioned scribes and scholars to collect stories from every village, every monastery, every court in our kingdom and beyond," Edmund explained. "I wanted to create a library worthy of the woman who taught me that stories have the power to transform not only individuals, but entire civilizations." Margot turned to him, tears of joy shining in her eyes. "It's magnificent," she whispered. "There's more," Edmund said, leading her to a central table where a particular manuscript awaited. This, the book open before her, was a masterpiece of illumination, each page a symphony of colors and intricate details. But it was the title that made her heart race. "The Lady and the Cursed Creature, a true story of redemption and love." "Our story," she said, turning the pages with reverence. Each chapter was magnificently illustrated, telling their journey from that first night in the tower to this moment of complete joy, so that future generations may understand that true love is not limited by appearances, social conditions, or even ancient curses, Edmund explained, so that they know that sometimes the happiest endings come to those who are brave enough to love beyond the world's expectations. Margot reached the final page, where an illumination depicted her not as a duchess in formal robes, but as a scribe at her table, her quill creating words that transformed into golden birds flying towards the rising sun. Below the illustration, in calligraphy she recognized as Edmund's, the final answer to her ancient riddle was written, "A story, woven from unspoken words between hearts that recognize each other, nourished by dreams that dare to imagine love beyond the limitations imposed by the world, blossoming into light when it finds the darkness needed for its growth." Like all the best stories, this one has no end, only beginnings that multiply into other stories, other lives touched by the proof that true love can indeed conquer any curse. Margot closed the book softly and turned to Edmund, finding in his amber eyes the same depth of love she had first seen on a distant night, when an impossible creature had offered not only union, but complete understanding. "The riddle is deciphered," she said. "It is," Edmund agreed, pulling her into his arms. "And the story we created together will be told as long as there are hearts that believe in the possibility of redemption through love." From the floor below, the sounds of celebration continued, but here in the tower where it all began, two lovers kissed under the benevolent gaze of the stars, knowing that they had found not only their happy ending, but the wisdom to live each day as a new chapter in a story of love that had proved to be stronger than any black magic. And so, as the feast of St. Michael continued below and the constellations told their own ancient stories in the darkening sky, Marguerite and Edmund of Thornwick wrote with their lives the proof that sometimes the greatest miracles are found not in the transformation of what we are, but in the complete and loving acceptance of our true nature.